I had been driving since noon, trying to get this delivery done before sunrise. The roads were quiet, almost too quiet, with just the occasional flicker of a passing light. I was alone out there, which wasn't unusual, but that night it felt different. Something was off, though I couldn't put my finger on it at first. I was hauling a load to a small town called Oak Ridge, way off the beaten path. The kind of place where nothing ever happens and no one sticks around longer than they need to. My dispatcher told me this was an easy route, smooth highways, hardly any traffic. But as the hours dragged on and the night grew darker, I started to wonder if that was true. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I thought about pulling over, maybe grabbing a nap. But I wanted to push through, just get the job done. The truck rumbled along, the tires humming against the pavement. The only company I had was the radio, though it kept cutting out. Static, then some faint country song, then more static. It felt like the whole world was fading away, and all that was left was me, my truck, and that empty highway. I don't know when exactly I noticed the headlights behind me. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. I was tired, zoning out, and at first I didn't think anything of it. Just another trucker on the road. But the thing was, he wasn't passing me. He stayed right behind me, close enough that his high beams practically lit up my whole cab. I slowed down a bit, figuring maybe he wanted to pass, but he didn't. He just hung back there, matching my speed, his headlights glaring in my mirrors. It started to mess with my head. Why wasn't he going around? I wasn't driving that slow, and there was plenty of room. But this guy, he seemed content just riding my tail. I tried shaking him off. I switched lanes a couple of times, even sped up to see if he'd get the hint. Nothing worked. He stuck behind me, not too far, not too close, just there. The longer he stayed, the more I could feel my nerves starting to fray. It was like he was toying with me, but for what reason? After what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for the CB radio, thinking maybe I could ask him what his deal was. My hand hovered over the mic, but then I hesitated. What if this guy wasn't just some trucker? What if something else was going on? My gut told me not to make contact. I dropped the mic and focused back on the road, hoping maybe he'd get bored and leave me alone. The miles ticked by, and the truck stayed glued to my rear. Every now and then, I'd glance in the mirrors, expecting him to pull back or change lanes, but he never did. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been. This wasn't normal. I knew that much, and yet I had no idea what to do about it. Finally, after about an hour of this, a faint light appeared on the horizon. A rest stop. I wasn't planning on stopping yet, but with this guy breathing down my neck, I figured it was as good a place as any to pull over and see what his deal was. Maybe he'd keep going, or maybe I could confront him. The rest stop was small, just a couple of parking spaces, an old diner, and a gas pump that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I pulled in, killing my engine, and sat there for a moment, waiting. I expected the truck to pull in behind me, but it didn't. It kept driving, those same blinding high beams fading into the distance. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe I'd been overthinking it. Maybe he was just some tired driver who didn't know how to turn off his brights. I climbed out of my cab, stretching my legs, trying to shake the tension from my shoulders. The air was cool, a little too still for my liking, but it felt good to be out of the truck. The diner was still open, surprisingly, and I figured I could use a cup of coffee before hitting the road again. There was an old man behind the counter, the kind of guy who's seen 1,000 truckers come through and didn't have time for small talk. I ordered a black coffee, sat down at one of the booths, and let my eyes drift around the place. I didn't see anyone else, just me and the old man. The silence was thick, only broken by the faint buzz of the diner's flickering neon sign outside. I felt a little better, though. That truck was gone, and I could finally relax. Maybe I'd been paranoid, but something still nagged at the back of my mind. Why had he followed me for so long? And why did he disappear the moment I pulled over? As I sipped my coffee, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see those headlights in the distance again. But there was nothing, just darkness stretching out as far as I could see. But then a shadow. It moved across the far end of the parking lot. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't big enough to be the truck, but someone was out there. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting, but it was hard to make out anything in the dim light. "Need anything else?" The old man's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I shook my head, standing up. No, I'm good. I left the diner and stepped back outside. The shadow was gone, and everything looked the same as before. Still, my skin prickled with unease. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put a name to it. All I knew was that I needed to get back on the road and put some distance between me and whatever was out there. As I climbed back into my truck, I glanced one last time at the empty parking lot. The shadow was gone. Or maybe it was never there. I couldn't tell anymore. I pulled back onto the highway, feeling a little more awake after the coffee, but still on edge. The guy in the truck hadn't followed me into the rest stop, and I convinced myself that maybe it was nothing, just some random driver who didn't know how to back off. But as I rolled through the empty roads again, the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. The night seemed darker now, like the stars themselves had disappeared. Only my headlights cut through the inky blackness, revealing just enough of the road to keep me moving forward. The trees lining the highway swayed gently in the breeze, but everything else was dead quiet. No cars, no signs of life. Just me and the open road. After another hour of driving, the uneasiness crept back in. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those same high beams flashing behind me again, but the road stayed empty. It was almost worse, like something was hiding just outside my vision, waiting for the right moment. That's when I saw it again, a flicker of headlights in the distance, slowly getting bigger. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just another trucker. But the way those lights grew, the slow, steady approach, it was too familiar. My stomach tightened. It had to be the same guy. I knew it. I tried to calm myself down, reasoning that I'd just overreacted before. He probably wasn't following me. Maybe he was just headed the same direction. But the tension in my shoulders didn't ease up. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was past 3 a.m. now, and I was still miles from Oak Ridge. I gripped the wheel tighter as the headlights drew closer. I couldn't see the truck behind them, but I didn't need to. I knew it was him. The same damn truck that had tailed me earlier, like some kind of ghost haunting my rearview mirror. I switched lanes again, hoping to shake him off, but he stayed locked on behind me, his high beams piercing into my mirrors. They were so bright, I could barely keep my eyes on the road. Come on, man, I muttered to myself. Just pass me already. But he didn't. Just like before, he stayed right behind me, pacing my every move. My heart started pounding, harder than it should have been. I could feel my hands sweating on the wheel, the tension creeping up my neck. What the hell was this guy's problem? I needed to get away from him. But on this stretch of highway, there weren't many options. No towns, no exits, just endless road ahead and nothing but the distant mountains to my left. I scanned the road signs, hoping to find another rest stop or at least a gas station where I could pull over, but nothing came up. The next turnoff wasn't for miles. My pulse quickened as the truck behind me sped up, closing the gap between us. He was almost right on my bumper now, his high beams flooding my cab with light. It felt like he was pushing me, daring me to go faster. I didn't know what to do. If I sped up, he'd just keep tailing me, and if I slowed down, he might plow right into me. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to focus, trying to think, but the longer he stayed there, the more panicked I felt. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just some random driver. He was playing with me, and I didn't know why. I spotted a small turnout ahead, one of those gravel patches meant for emergency stops, and made a quick decision. I slammed on my brakes and swerved off the road, my truck jolting as it hit the uneven ground. The headlights behind me flashed past, the truck roaring by at full speed. For a brief second, I saw the silhouette of the driver's cab as he zoomed past, a hulking shape larger than any truck I'd seen before. I watched as his taillights faded into the distance, my heart still hammering in my chest. He didn't stop, didn't slow down, just kept going, disappearing into the night like he'd never even been there. I sat there in the dark for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still gripping the wheel, knuckles white. The engine idled softly, the low rumble, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was clear. That truck wasn't just another driver. There was something wrong, something off. I grabbed my phone, fingers trembling, and checked the GPS again, but it was still dead. No signal, no way of knowing how far I was from the next town. I cursed under my breath and shoved the phone back into the cup holder. For a long moment, I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around, head back to the last stop, and wait for daylight. But the other part of me knew I had to keep going. I couldn't stay parked in the middle of nowhere, waiting for that truck to come back. Taking a deep breath, I pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors constantly, watching for any sign of those headlights. But the road behind me stayed empty. I drove on, my heart still racing, my mind trying to piece together what had just happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That trucker had been following me for a reason, and I had a sinking feeling that I hadn't seen the last of him. The highway stretched out in front of me, an endless ribbon of black asphalt cutting through the night. My eyes were locked on the road, but I couldn't stop checking the mirrors, waiting for those headlights to appear again. I kept telling myself it was over, that the trucker was long gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere behind me, watching. The road was darker now, the faint glow of distant towns completely gone. No streetlights, no signs of life, just the cold, empty night. It felt like I was driving through a tunnel, even though I was out in the open. The darkness pressed in from all sides, and the hum of the engine was the only thing keeping me grounded. I tried to focus, keep my mind on the road, but the encounter with that truck had rattled me. My heart hadn't quite stopped pounding, and every bump in the road made me jump. I needed to calm down. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that the guy was probably headed the same way and didn't even realize how close he'd been. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It wasn't just in my head. The way he had stayed behind me for miles, never passing, never backing off, it wasn't random. He was following me. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road just ahead. The trees on either side were thick, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, casting long shadows that danced in the corner of my vision. I blinked hard, trying to shake the exhaustion that was creeping in. The adrenaline from earlier had faded, leaving behind a heavy, bone-deep fatigue. I thought about pulling over again, maybe getting some rest, but the thought of sitting alone in my truck, in the middle of nowhere with that guy possibly still out there, it made my skin crawl. I checked the clock. It was a little after 4 a.m. Oak Ridge was still a couple of hours away, and the night felt like it was dragging on forever. I told myself I could make it. Just a few more hours, and I'd be done with this route. No more empty highways, no more creepy truckers. Just a quiet motel bed and a hot shower. But as the minutes ticked by, that sense of unease only grew stronger. The longer I drove, the more the road felt wrong. Like it wasn't just an ordinary stretch of highway anymore. It was too quiet, too still. I hadn't seen another car in hours, not even on the other side of the road. Usually, there'd be at least the occasional late-night traveler or another trucker. But tonight, it was like the world had emptied out, leaving me completely alone. My mind started playing tricks on me. Every shadow in the trees looked like something moving, something creeping toward the road. Every flicker of light in the distance seemed like it might be headlights, only to disappear when I blinked. I tried turning on the radio again, hoping some music would distract me, but all I got was static. The same dead crackle I'd heard before, like the airwaves themselves had gone silent. The longer I drove, the worse it got. I was tired, too tired, and the road was starting to blur. I could feel myself slipping, my eyes getting heavier with each mile. I slapped my face, rolled down the window for some fresh air, but it didn't help. I needed to stop. I knew it, but every time I thought about pulling over, I remembered that truck, those headlights, and my gut twisted with fear. Suddenly, my dashboard lit up, a warning light flashing red. I cursed under my breath and glanced down. The engine temperature gauge was climbing. Fast. No, not now, I muttered, my hands tightening on the wheel. The truck started to sputter, the engine coughing like it was struggling to keep going. I pressed down on the gas, hoping to push through, but the truck shuddered violently, jerking to the side. I swore again, my heart racing as I fought to keep control, but the engine was dying. I could feel it. The dashboard lights blinked out one by one, and the truck coasted to a stop on the side of the road. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. The engine was silent now. The faint ticking sound of cooling metal, the only noise in the thick, suffocating darkness. I leaned back in my seat, closing my eyes for a second, trying to calm myself down. This was just bad luck, I told myself. The truck had been acting fine earlier. It was probably just overheating. Nothing I couldn't handle. I grabbed my phone, hoping I could call for a tow, but when I looked at the screen, my stomach dropped. No signal, not even a single bar. Of course, I muttered, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. I sat there for a minute, staring out at the dark road ahead. The silence was oppressive, pressing in from all sides. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, just nothing. I didn't like it. My truck breaking down in the middle of nowhere was bad enough, but the isolation, the darkness, it was suffocating. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there all night. I popped the hood and climbed out of the cab, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. It smelled different out here, like damp earth, and something else I couldn't quite place. The engine was still warm, and I leaned over trying to figure out what was wrong. I wasn't a mechanic, but I knew enough to check the basics. The problem was, I couldn't see much of anything in the dim light from my phone screen. I sighed, wiping my hands on my jeans. This was going to take longer than I thought. Maybe I could get it started again, maybe not. But the longer I stayed out there, the more that creeping sense of unease grew. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like I was being watched. I turned around, my eyes scanning the empty road behind me. And that's when I saw it. A single pair of headlights in the distance, slowly getting closer. My heart dropped into my stomach. As soon as I saw the headlights in the distance, my stomach clenched and I felt my pulse quicken. They were far away, but heading straight for me, steady and relentless. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was him. The same trucker who'd been tailing me earlier. I thought I had lost him, thought he was long gone. But there he was coming back. My first instinct was to jump back into my truck, lock the doors, and hope he passed by without stopping. But my truck wasn't going anywhere. The engine was dead, and I was stranded on the side of the road with no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. I stood there for a moment, frozen, trying to decide what to do. The headlights were getting closer. I glanced around, scanning the darkness for something, anything. The trees loomed on either side of the highway, thick and unwelcoming, their shadows stretching across the pavement like dark fingers. There was no way I could run into the woods without getting lost, and besides, my legs felt like lead. The only thing I could do was stand there and wait. The truck's engine rumbled louder as it approached, the sound cutting through the silence of the night. The headlights grew brighter, casting long shadows across the road. I couldn't see the driver yet, but I knew he was there, watching me, coming for me. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. What did he want? Why had he been following me? The truck slowed as it neared, the engine growling like some kind of beast. It came to a stop just a few feet from where I stood, the headlights blinding me, making it impossible to see the driver. For a long moment, there was nothing but the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, the door creaked open. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The driver climbed out, his boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. He was a big guy, broad-shouldered, wearing the same worn-out baseball cap and a faded jacket. He moved slowly, almost deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "Truck trouble," he called out, his voice deep and gravelly. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "Yeah," I managed to say, my throat dry. "Engine overheated or something." He nodded, taking a few steps closer. The way he moved, calm and unhurried, made my skin crawl. There was something about him that didn't sit right, something off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew I didn't want him getting too close. "You need help?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something in his voice, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I hesitated. I didn't trust him, not one bit, but I was stuck. My truck wasn't going anywhere, and I couldn't fix it on my own. I didn't have many options. "Yeah," I finally said, forcing the words out. "If you know anything about engines, I could use a hand." He grunted in response and walked around to the front of my truck, peering under the hood. I stood back, watching him closely, every nerve in my body on high alert. My mind was racing, trying trying to figure out what his game was. Was he just some helpful stranger? Or was there more to it? The way he'd been following me earlier, how he'd shown up out of nowhere, it didn't feel like a coincidence. He leaned over the engine, fiddling with something for what felt like an eternity. I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. I kept glancing at the road, half expecting another truck to come by, but the highway was still deserted. It was just me and him, alone in the middle of nowhere. After a few minutes, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "Should be good now," he said, his voice low and steady. "Try it?" I hesitated for a moment, but then climbed into the cab and turned the key. To my surprise, the engine roared to life, purring like it had never been a problem in the first place. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thanks," I said, my voice shaky but genuine. "I appreciate it." He didn't respond at first, just stood there staring at the truck like he was thinking about something. Then, slowly, he looked up at me, his eyes hidden in the shadow of his cap. "Be careful out here," he said, his voice carrying an edge that sent a chill down my spine. "These roads can be dangerous." I nodded, not sure how to respond. His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. He didn't sound like he was giving friendly advice. It felt more like a warning. Without saying anything else, he turned and walked back to his truck. I watched as he climbed inside, the engine rumbling to life once again. For a moment, I thought he would just drive off, disappear into the night like he had before. But instead, he sat there, idling, the headlights casting long shadows across the road. I didn't wait around to find out what he was doing. I shifted into gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. The truck didn't move. It just sat there, the headlights burning bright, watching me as I drove away. My hands were shaking on the wheel, my mind racing. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I had to keep moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whole thing had been some kind of trap, like he'd been waiting for me to break down, waiting for the right moment to show up. As the miles rolled by, the headlights of his truck finally disappeared in the distance, swallowed by the darkness. But the tension in my chest didn't ease. Something about his warning stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. "Be careful out here. These roads can be dangerous." I repeated the words to myself, trying to make sense of them. There was something he wasn't telling me, something lurking just beneath the surface. And as I drove through the endless night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was still out there, waiting for me. The farther I drove, the more the tension began to creep back into my body. Despite the trucker's warning and the eerie feeling he'd left behind, I convinced myself I was in the clear. The road had returned to its familiar empty silence, just the hum of my engine and the rhythmic clunk of my tires hitting the occasional crack in the pavement. But that uneasy feeling, that itch on the back of my neck, never really went away. The words the trucker had said, "These roads can be dangerous," kept echoing in my head. I couldn't shake them, no matter how hard I tried to focus on getting to Oak Ridge. The trees lining the highway felt closer now, their branches hanging low, casting thick, twisting shadows on the road. The moon was mostly hidden behind clouds, offering little light, and the highway itself seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, an unbroken line leading into the dark. The deeper I drove, the more it felt like I wasn't going anywhere at all, like the road was looping back on itself, trapping me in some kind of nightmarish limbo. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was nearly 5 a.m. I should have been closer to Oak Ridge by now, but I hadn't seen a single sign for it. My mind started playing tricks on me. Had I missed a turn? Was my GPS wrong? Or was I just too tired, imagining things that weren't really there? Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I tried to keep it in check. Panicking wasn't going to help. I kept driving, hoping that Oak Ridge would suddenly appear on the horizon. But the road just kept going. No signs, no lights. Nothing. That's when I saw it, the flicker of headlights again in the distance. My heart skipped a beat, and I tightened my grip on the wheel. The same bright, glaring lights, slowly getting closer. It was him. It had to be. I felt my stomach twist in knots as the truck approached from behind, closing the distance between us with an unnerving steadiness. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just another trucker out here on the same route. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't random. The headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me with their intensity. The truck pulled up behind me, closer than ever before, practically kissing my bumper. I tried to keep my eyes on the road, but the bright lights were making it impossible to focus. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands slick with sweat on the wheel. "Why are you doing this?" I muttered under my breath, frustration and fear mixing in my voice. I couldn't figure out what his game was. Was he trying to run me off the road? Was he just messing with me? Or was there something worse going on? I pressed down on the gas, picking up speed. My truck roared in response, and for a moment, I thought I could put some distance between us. But the truck behind me didn't slow down. He sped up, matching my pace, his headlights blazing into my mirrors, filling the cab with a harsh, glaring light that made it impossible to see anything. I felt trapped, like a caged animal with nowhere to go. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it drowning out everything else. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I needed to get away from him. I spotted a narrow turnout up ahead, one of those barely used side roads that cut through the woods. I didn't have time to think about it. I jerked the wheel to the right, my tires screeching as I veered off the highway and onto the side road. The truck behind me sped past, barreling down the highway like a freight train. For a brief moment, I felt a surge of relief. I'd lost him. I was safe. But that relief was short-lived. As I drove down the narrow road, the trees closing in on either side, I realized I had no idea where I was going. The road was barely wide enough for my truck, winding through the dense woods like a snake. My headlights bounced off the thick trunks and low-hanging branches, casting eerie shadows that twisted and moved in the corner of my eye. I kept going, trying to put as much distance between me and the highway as possible. But the deeper I drove, the more I realized how isolated I really was. There were no signs, no lights, no landmarks. Just the dark woods and the narrow road that seemed to go on forever. And then, as if on cue, the truck sputtered again. The dashboard lights flickered, and I felt the familiar jolt of the engine struggling beneath me. "Not again," I muttered, my voice rising with panic. I slammed my hand against the wheel, trying to keep the truck moving, but it was no use. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then died completely, leaving me stranded in the middle of the woods. I sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. The truck was dead again, and I had no way of knowing where I was, no way of calling for help. I grabbed my phone, desperate for a signal, but it was still useless. No bars, no service. Just a black screen mocking me in the dark. I leaned back in my seat, trying to catch my breath, trying to figure out what to do next. The woods outside were unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. My gut twisted with a familiar sense of unease. And then I heard it, the low rumble of an engine in the distance. My heart dropped into my stomach. It was him. He'd found me. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat as the headlights appeared once more, faint at first, but slowly growing brighter as they approached from the direction I had come. I watched frozen as the truck rolled down the narrow road toward me, its headlights cutting through the trees like knives. This time, there was no mistaking it. He wasn't just following me. He was coming for me. I had to move. I had to get out of there, but my truck wasn't going anywhere, and I was trapped in the middle of the woods with nowhere to hide. I opened the door, my legs shaky as I stepped out onto the cold ground. The headlights were getting closer, the engine louder. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for him to find me. Without thinking, I bolted into the woods, my feet crunching on the underbrush as I ran deeper into the darkness. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my arms and face as I stumbled through the thick brush, trying to put as much distance between me and the road as possible. But I could still hear him. The truck had stopped, and now the engine had cut off. I ran blindly through the thick forest, my heart pounding in my ears, branches snapping beneath my feet, the cold night air burning in my lungs. Every part of me screamed to keep going, to get as far away from that truck as possible. But it was hard to see where I was going. The trees loomed closer together the deeper I went, their gnarled branches clawing at me like hands trying to pull me back. Behind me, the forest was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't hear the truck anymore, but I knew that didn't mean it was gone. The driver was out there, somewhere, probably watching me right now. I kept telling myself I could outrun him, that if I just kept moving, I'd find a road or a clearing or something. Anything, but as I stumbled deeper into the woods, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. I was lost. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath, every nerve in my body still on high alert. My eyes darted around the dark forest, looking for movement, listening for any sound. But there was nothing, just the oppressive quiet of the woods, the shadows of the trees shifting in the pale moonlight. I stood there, panting, trying to think. I needed to figure out where I was. I pulled out my phone again, more out of habit than hope, but it was still dead. No signal. No help. I shoved it back into my pocket, frustration mixing with fear. Then, out of the silence, I heard it. A single footstep. Close. Too close. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but I couldn't see anyone. Just the same empty stretch of forest. But I knew someone was there. I could feel it. That same gut-wrenching sense of being watched that had been gnawing at me all night. Another footstep, this time from behind me. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I bolted again, tearing through the trees as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. My lungs burned. My muscles screamed in protest, but I kept running, pushing through the thick underbrush, stumbling over rocks and roots. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps followed. Steady, unhurried, like whoever or whatever was behind me wasn't in any rush. Like they knew I had nowhere to go. My mind was racing. Who was this guy? Why was he doing this? And what did he want? The questions kept piling up, but I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that he was playing with me, toying with me like a cat with a mouse. And I had fallen right into his trap. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I felt myself falling, tumbling down a steep embankment. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me, dirt and leaves sticking to my skin. I lay there for a moment, dazed, staring up at the dark sky through the canopy of trees, trying to catch my breath. I couldn't move. Every muscle in my body ached, and my mind was spinning. I didn't even know how far I'd fallen, but it felt like miles. Slowly, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, wincing at the pain that shot through my side. My head was throbbing, and I tasted blood in my mouth. For a second, I thought maybe I'd lost him. Maybe the fall had bought me some time. But then I heard it, that same steady crunch of footsteps on leaves, coming from above. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped right at the top of the embankment. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then, through the trees, I saw him. The trucker, standing there, looking down at me. I couldn't make out his face, hidden beneath the shadow of his cap. But I knew it was him. His broad shoulders, his heavy boots, the way he stood, like he had all the time in the world. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, watching me like he was waiting for something. My body tensed, adrenaline flooding my veins. I knew I couldn't stay here. If I didn't move, I was dead. But if I ran again, would I make it? Could I outrun him? I didn't have a choice. Slowly, I shifted my weight, preparing to bolt again. But before I could move, he took a step forward. "Stop running," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "You're only making this harder for yourself." His words sent a shiver down my spine. There was no anger in his voice, no malice. Just cold certainty, like he already knew how this was going to end. I stood there, frozen, staring up at him, my mind racing. How did he know? How had he found me so easily? And then like a switch flipping, it hit me. This wasn't the first time. He'd done this before. The warnings, the eerie calm, the way he'd followed me so deliberately without rushing, it all made sense now. This guy wasn't just some random trucker. He was hunting me. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by the realization. But as the truth sunk in, a surge of panic hit me like a freight train. I had to move now. I turned and ran, my legs burning, my body screaming in protest as I pushed through the pain. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, as fast as I could, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling my ears. I could still hear him behind me, those same steady footsteps, never speeding up, never slowing down. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. He knew I couldn't escape. But I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to give up. Then, just when I thought my legs might give out, I saw something up ahead. A light. Faint, but there. Hope surged through me, pushing me forward. Maybe it was a cabin. Maybe someone was out there. Someone who could help. I stumbled toward the light, my heart pounding with desperation. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cabin at all. It was a road. A small, narrow road cutting through the woods. In the light, it was headlights. A car. Without thinking, I darted toward the road, waving my arms, shouting as loud as I could. The car slowed, the headlights blinding me as it approached. I ran toward it, my legs barely holding me up, but before I could reach it, the door opened, and I froze. Standing there, bathed in the glow of the headlights, was the trucker. His truck had somehow made it here first. I didn't have time to scream.